Okay, so let's move from part one of the discourse to part two. So we talked about perfectibility, we talked about reason and pity, and the divide between natural man and modern man. Now we're looking specifically at inequality and where it came from. So again, we're dealing with this sort of societal inequality, not natural inequality. And here is where Rousseau gets into kind of the nitty gritty about where inequality came from and how it happened, and he traces it back to private property. Locke has this view about property that it's like this natural right. That basically God gave us the right to own property, and Rousseau says no, that's dead wrong. Property came from one person, one time, who said, "Hey, I own this piece of land," and everybody around him was dumb enough to believe him. And the person who decided to own something was the founder of civil society. So there's no justification for property ownership other than one time, one person, decided to own something. So what you're looking at in part two of the discourse is this. It's like this really cool retelling of the Genesis story. So if you remember from the book of Genesis, you've got man's fall from grace in the Garden of Eden. You've got the same thing going on here. Man's fall from grace, the original sin. The Garden of Eden is the state of nature, according to Rousseau. So what he does is he says, look, there were two revolutions in history. This is really simple and really bad anthropology or whatever, but the first revolution was the shift from small family units to small civil societies, right? To tribes and small groups and stuff like that. And then from there we shifted into political societies, so governments and laws. And this is where Rousseau identifies the rich and powerful introducing laws in government to protect their own interests and security. So basically, the person who encloses a plot of land and calls it his property is just like Eve eating from the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. So that's the original sin, and man's tumble from grace accelerates the more that private property spreads. The more property people own, the more inequality that happens and grows. And the more inequality that grows, now we have more needless desires, right? Because I see that this person has this thing and I want it too. Needless desires bring on unnecessary poverty and a concentration of wealth and division of labor. And finally, the ultimate blow, Rousseau says, is the institution of laws that actually sanctifies slavery. And born free, the human being suddenly finds himself totally enslaved to civil society. We'll kind of see this more when we get to Marx in the second half of the semester, how we are subject to this system that just continues to exploit us, and we kind of just are stuck in it and we can't get out of it. Rousseau says, we were all so excited about the possibilities of civil society that we didn't think about the dangers of it. So he says, everyone just ran to chain themselves, thinking that they had secured their liberty, and they were only concerned with the advantages of a political establishment. They weren't concerned with the dangers that they could face. The more advanced civil society becomes, the more we care about what others think about us, right? Because now it's like you have to keep up with the Joneses. So people started looking at other people, and public esteem started to have a value, and he says this was the first step toward inequality and vice. And from these first preferences were born vanity and contempt on one hand, and shame and envy on the other. Also in part two, he really gets into this groove where he rails against technology, which is kind of funny, and you'll talk about that in the voice thread discussion. But he says, for the poet it's gold and silver, but for the philosopher it is iron and wheat that have civilized men and totally ruined the human race. So he's got this really negative view about civil society, which is pretty uncommon. It's kind of laughable, I think, in this day and age. although I don't think there's nothing to sympathize with here, because I think everyone sort of gets to the point sometimes where you just want to unplug, you know, and just get away from all of the hassle and all of the bills and all of the crazy stuff here. Well, the problem though is that, you know, even Rousseau says we can't go back. We can't get back to the state of nature, so he's not dumb enough to argue that we could just leave all of this behind. Um, so society is corrupting, property is damaging, and it makes us unequal, and civilization ruins us, but we can't go back to the state of nature. Well, what do? I don't know, the solution he gives us is not very satisfying. He thinks that we can sort of reconcile our natural, original nature with the natural world around us by not relying on technology and not advancing, like not just advancing for the purpose of advancing. I know that that's not a really good answer. It's probably not that satisfying from someone who like raises all these issues and then just says like, well, by the way, this is all that can be done about it. But I think it's really it's interesting to think about, you know, how civilization has changed us. Whether Rousseau is right about civilization and human nature is definitely up for grabs. There's no real evidence for any of this stuff. I mean, it's not like Rousseau is doing like some wicked anthropology or anything. So we can't be certain about whether Rousseau's picture of man in the state of nature is better than Hobbes's, or if all of them are wrong. So there's that to consider. Definitely, we don't really know what natural humans were like, and we will probably never know. But I do think that we can be reflective and critical about civilization, and Rousseau gives us a really good vehicle for doing that. So that's all I have to say about the discourse on the origin of inequality. And yeah, you should have enough to discuss from there.